In 2026, something unusual is happening in global geopolitics. America hasn't collapsed, the dollar hasn't been dethroned, US military power hasn't faded. And yet, America's closest allies are quietly changing how they deal with Washington, not by breaking away, not by openly confronting the US, but by hedging, systematically, deliberately. And across economics, security, and diplomacy. This isn't anti-Americanism, it's risk management. And it is being driven by two defining features of the second Trump administration: Liberation Day tariffs and what many analysts now call the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, today. I want to explain why US allies are de-risking from American power, how they're doing it without triggering retaliation, and what this means for the future global order. The core shift has been from dependence to de-risking. The key idea to understand is this: the world is no longer trying to decouple from the United States. It's trying to de-risk from unilateral American decisions. The US still dominates finance, technology, and security. But under Trump's second term, power is being exercised in a more transactional and conditional way. Tariffs can appear overnight. Security guarantees are openly questioned. Trade access is increasingly linked to political alignment for allies. That creates a new problem. What happens if the US changes the rules again? So instead of betting everything on Washington, countries are building structural hedges, insurance policies against American unpredictability. 1. Economic hedging, trading around Washington. The most visible hedging is economic. After Liberation Day in April 2025, the US imposed universal reciprocal tariffs that pushed average tariff levels to their highest point in a century. The response wasn't panic, it was rerouting. Canada's quiet reset with China under Prime Minister Mark Carney. Canada made a striking move. Tariffs on Chinese imports were cut to just over 6%. Agricultural concessions were secured for Canadian canola exports. This wasn't about embracing Beijing, it was about supply chain optionality. Canada concluded that being too dependent on US trade policy was itself a vulnerability. The EU-Mercosur deal, in January 2026, after 25 years of deadlock. The EU finalized its trade agreement with Mercosur. That timing wasn't a coincidence. It created new export markets, non-dollar trade channels, and leverage against future US protectionism. Asia's insurance policy. Meanwhile in Asia, CPTPP membership expanded. ASEAN quietly strengthened dispute resolution mechanisms. Regional trade flows increasingly bypassed US-centered frameworks. The message was clear: if access to the US becomes conditional, alternatives must exist. Security hedging began to see the cracks in the NATO umbrella. The more sensitive hedging is happening in security. Trump's framing, sometimes friends are worse than foes, has deeply unsettled allies. Europe's strategic wake-up call. The turning point for Europe was the US-brokered Ukraine peace initiative, negotiated largely without European input. The response: Europe took on more war financing. Defense procurement shifted toward European systems. Less reliance on US-controlled platforms like the F-35. This isn't anti-NATO, it's NATO-minus-single-point-of-failure. The Indo-Pacific nuclear question. Even more striking, Japan and South Korea, long pillars of US security architecture, are now openly debating sovereign nuclear capabilities. That debate alone would have been unthinkable a decade ago. India, by contrast, continues integrating with US military systems but carefully preserving autonomy. The pattern again is hedging, not abandonment, diplomatically. The shift is subtle but profound. At the November 2025 G20 summit in South Africa, no senior US delegation attended. No senior Chinese delegation attended either. That absence created space. What we saw was the rise of middle power coordination. Countries like Canada, India, the EU, Australia have begun coordinating without Washington or Beijing as default anchors. The 2026 Greenland crisis was a key example. When Trump threatened 25% tariffs unless Denmark ceded Greenland, Europe coordinated rapidly. Canada aligned. A unified response forced de-escalation. The result was the informal Davos framework, a reminder that multilateral pressure can still constrain US actions, rather than building new systems. Middle powers are doubling down on the UN, WHO, WTO mechanisms. Not because they're perfect, but because institutional collapse would benefit China far more than the US. So who isn't hedging? There are exceptions. Not everyone is de-risking. Mexico has chosen deep alignment. Its economy is too tightly bound to the US market to hedge meaningfully. Security cooperation, even US involvement against cartels, is seen as unavoidable. Israel's strategic and military integration with the US reinforced by the 12-day war with Iran makes hedging impractical. The Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, actually benefit from Trump's transactional approach. Capital flows into US energy and AI infrastructure have surged for them. Alignment is profitable. So what does this all really mean? This shift doesn't mean America is losing power. In fact, the US remains the dominant financial system, the core security provider, the ultimate market of last resort, but power is being priced differently. Allies are no longer assuming stability. They're assuming volatility and planning accordingly. That creates a quieter, more complex world, less loyalty, more optionality, more friction beneath the surface. In effect, we are moving towards a multipolar system built on hedging. The global order of 2026 isn't post-American. It's American but hedged. The US still sits at the center, but fewer countries are willing to bet everything on Washington's consistency. The irony is this: by exercising power more forcefully, the US has encouraged others to become more independent without ever openly challenging it. That's the paradox of the Trump era: not retreat, not collapse, but a world quietly learning how to live with American unpredictability.